reason why we wanted to have this session in the conference is we wanted to sort of demystify, decode a lot of the climate science issues that we're facing. This is not the only session that looks at that. We have another one that comes up looking at climate science with a Caribbean focus. But this session is a plenary one where we're specifically looking at having a conversation with Kalain Hussein, a prominent meteorologist in the Caribbean, who is going to give us some of his insight, background on what makes climate science so important, besides the obvious, and how we as activists, especially those of you in attendance who are Gen Z activists, how you can use certain communication tools to get your message across so that you come across a lot more credible, and we can really get a little bit more engagement with people who have zero idea what you mean by 1.5 to stay alive. So with that, Kalain is with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us. He's an award-winning multimedia journalist based in Trinidad and Tobago, and he has his company called the Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center. But that's not all that he does. He is the face of weather in Trinidad, dare I say, with the Guardian Media Group. And he has covered everything from COP27, your latest and biggest storms. He is somebody who really understands the climate science behind what is driving the weather that we see. And there's a difference between climate and weather, which we might touch on at some point. But we also want to understand too, how do you communicate that climate science? So why not bring a meteorologist on? So Kalain, with that, want to get started with the first question, which is really around, we're never going to spend 40 minutes that the session has to decode and really deconstruct climate science. If you did that, I mean, not even ChatGPT can do that. So if we were able to achieve that, there would be no point of this conference. The world global boiling will be solved. But what are some key things that you think that every Gen Z activist or climate activist on a whole needs to have in their armory where climate science is concerned? Key terms, key understanding. I'll leave you with that. Very easy question.
Yeah, I think the most important thing any climate activist or any science communicator should know is how to break down these very complex ideas into very layman's terms. So first off, what is climate change? So just being able to explain that to people, climate change is a long-term change in our climate as a result of a warmer Earth, resulting in a warmer temperatures and a change in our weather patterns. We also need to describe what exactly is making climate change worse. Yeah. So that would be enhanced greenhouse gases, which would be, and you also have to explain this as well, what are greenhouse gases? So that's carbon dioxide, methane, which comes from fossil fuel burning, as well as nitrous oxide, which also comes from industrial use. And then going through all of the different ways our climate is being changed and how that is being impacted. Those are some of the things I think people need to know. So, and more importantly too, how is it affecting where you live? I focus on the Caribbean region, specifically Trinidad and Tobago. So all of our small island states are being affected quite similarly, where we're getting warmer overall temperatures both day and night. Our seas are rising as a result of melting ice caps. We are getting less overall rainfall in the tropics where we live, but when it does fall, it falls in extreme amounts, causing significant street, flash, riverine flooding. And these are just some of the many impacts that you need to be able to explain very succinctly, but also very easily to the average person, because it's always important to never assume that the person that you're speaking to knows anything about climate change. I always like to approach these things with the person that you're speaking to is 5 years old, and you go from there. You educate from there.
All right. Okay. I'll treat you a little bit older than 5 years old. But let's say you start the conversation and somebody asks, okay, what is climate science? And you gave me that thread of explanation, and then we went with greenhouse gases. And then after greenhouse gases, you might want to explain methane, but then somebody asks, what is methane? And then you have to, where do we stop breaking it down? Where does the light bulb moment happen for you where you're like, okay, I could stop. This person has gotten the concept they need in order to really move forward with it, with everything?
It's a good question. I think because climate science and everything around climate change is so complex and so lengthy, I just keep explaining the whys, but what is, and that kind of thing until they feel that they're sufficient and they stop asking questions. Now, I will always follow that up with, say anything else you want to know. before I stopped. I think that's where that light bulb moment could happen. But at the same time, it is a lot to take in all at once.
Yeah.
So you really have to break it down into digestible moments and really try to focus in on one topic when you're trying to break that down.
Yeah, no, it's not easy, and the communication bit is quite a challenge. I know in today's media, for instance, today's activism with, you know, the Just Stop Oil movements that we see on TV all the time, it's a whole different sort of ballpark. People are tired, there's miscommunication, there's misinformation, there's a lack of trust in our governance systems as well. And so we get these sort of retaliations, whether it be through virtual or sort of in-person protests. But, you know, those terms, Just Stop Oil, or, you know, when I was teaching in Jamaica in UWI Mona, I'd have some people be like, you know, we need 100% renewable energy. But the question is, do we actually need 100% renewable energy? And why do we need this sort of renewable energy system? So what do you think are some of the things in terms of the key climate science underpinnings that we need to understand in terms of this is our world that's changing, and here are some things that you need to understand there?
Okay. So yes, we do need to move to renewables. We need to move to non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And the reason why I say that is because the burning of fossil fuels, that's why we are in the predicament we are in. Because burning fossil fuels release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide into our atmosphere. Now, these gases trap heat and cause an enhanced greenhouse effect, leading to our rising global temperatures. Now, scientific research has shown that the Earth's average temperature has been increasing over the last century, and it is primarily because of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And as a result, we're dealing with, you know, stronger storms, record-breaking ocean temperatures, and you just need to walk outside to feel the heat. This weekend, actually, because of a very strong hurricane moving north of the Caribbean region, most of the Eastern Caribbean rather, will be experiencing what we would consider a heat wave. Because of not only that storm, but because we have a very warm background level as a result of these warm ocean temperatures. Now, in addition to, you know, we want to move to renewables. We look at what scientists and climate scientists have modeled, and they use these computer models, these numerical weather prediction models to simulate various factors. That's where we have the RCPs 2.6 all the way to 8.5. And these are different models that these climate scientists have developed to show our various levels of warming when it comes to our emission or further emission of greenhouse gases. And they project a range of outcomes, but because oil is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the transport industry and energy industries, reducing oil consumption is a crucial step. So that is why now we need to start pivoting and making this green energy transition to solar, to wind, to hydroelectric, to geothermal if it's available. But that comes with a caveat. So today in Trinidad's Business Guardian, I actually had the lead story there where we talked about Trinidad's commitment to natural gas as a transition fuel. That is a predicament a lot of our smaller countries are facing, particularly Trinidad and Tobago's economy. It's the backbone of that was oil and gas. Guyana has discovered a significant amount of petrochemicals in their natural reservoirs, and now they're extracting that. The thing is, we've had these G20 countries responsible for 80% of our emissions. They managed to gain from the spoils of all extracting the Earth's resources, polluting the atmosphere, and now they're in a better financial position to make this transition because it's not cheap. You have to get solar panels to do that. You need to get the rare minerals to not only produce the panels, but also produce the batteries for that. And that includes electric vehicles as well. Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the Caribbean region, we don't have that much wealth to, you know, make that transition as quickly. So we're stuck in a predicament where we need to still extract these resources to, you know, better our economy and focus those funds into other national priorities like education, tackling poverty, making our countries adapt and become resilient to the impacts of climate change while also looking at our energy and economic security. So small island states, climate activists from especially Trinidad are in a pickle because these other international activists can always point, well, look at your country. Your country is still producing petrochemicals and is still polluting the atmosphere. Well, yeah, we kind of have to survive because we are not getting the funding that is needed to support our green energy transition as quickly as the rest of the world.
Mm.
Thankfully, we're seeing steps in the right direction, new funding facilities coming up. But this is why climate activism can't be looked through a pigeonhole or a very narrow lens. You have to be well researched and look at where these shortcomings are from your region, but also look at where similar countries, similar economies are making strides and how that can be used, and use your voice to amplify the better way to do things in your region.
I feel like you've given me enough to unpack there for another 3-hour discussion, but we're not hearing you and we don't have time for that. So I will focus on then that last point where you said, we need these resources. You get into the whole question of G20 and the global South divide, and who has reaped the benefits from the spoils, and then who now needs to advance their own economies to be able, as you say, to survive, and then be able to sort of promote these industrialized economies that are very hard because there's so much lock-in, and it's very hard to remove ourselves from that. But it's very important to understand the background there. So, we constantly hear about 1.5 and 2 degrees warming, and we have, an activist from Trinidad who might be saying that, and then somebody comes pointing the finger and it's like, oh, well, do you know in 2010 you were second in the world behind Qatar and carbon emissions per capita, and then you're like, well, but it's per capita. But the whole point is that we can't have, like you said, this pigeonhole view. We need to expand our evidence base, and it's all about being open to, when somebody gives you a sort of statement or challenge, it's going away and disseminating that. And so where 1.5 in particular and 2 degrees are concerned, how are the best ways that you think activists can really send the message home that we're really in the hot end of things and we need to have action now? But when they say 1.5, it's such a small number. Why does that hold so much weight?
So for every degree of warming that the world experiences, our air can hold more moisture. For every degree of warming that the world experiences, we lose miles and miles, or kilometers and kilometers, depending on which unit you use, of ice caps. The result of that would be catastrophic rise in sea levels. And we are already seeing the rainfall aspect of it play out. And you can just look at it's Friday. So the last 5 days, we've had deadly floods in Spain, Greece, Hong Kong, Turkey, Brazil. All of these countries saw the most amount of rain that some of them have ever recorded in history within a 24-hour period. Greece is a perfect example of that, where they saw near a year worth of rainfall inside 24 hours. And these extreme rainfall events have been made more likely to occur as a result of a warmer world. Now, let's break down the 1.5 and 2 degrees. So 1.5 degrees of warming is an aspirational target. Nowhere in the Paris Agreement does it explicitly say we need to keep the level of warming below 1.5 degrees. And that is 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. Currently, we're at 1.2. So we're getting very close to that. Now, it's associated with less severe climate impacts. But as you can see, what's playing out outside, it's already pretty bad. But it's the reduced risk of extreme weather events, of sea level rise, damage to ecosystem and biodiversity. So the message that activists should be using is this 1.5 degree target is a powerful message to emphasize the urgency of climate action, but exceeding this threshold is not only within the realm of possibility, but these fires that we saw in Canada that blanketed parts of the United States and made it to Europe, these deadly floods we're seeing in many parts of the world, the deadly heat waves that we're seeing in the middle of winter in South America, these record-breaking temperatures we're seeing in North America, the Middle East, Europe, China. All of these things are playing out under 1.1 or 1.2 degrees of warming. What is 1.5 going to look like? And 1.5 is on the less severe end of things. When we look at the 2 degree of warming above pre-industrial levels, this would lead to severe and potentially irreversible climate impacts. So it would result in, increased risk of extreme weather events, threats to food security, rising sea levels, where our small island states, most of our populations are near the coast. We could see significant impacts to not only population disruption, but our trade, our economies, our major cities become inundated. And, that will it could also, at that 2-degree level of warming, trigger what we call feedback loops that cause even more warming. Because at 2 degrees, we will start to see a lot more fires erupt in parts that would usually fire vulnerable.
Yep.
And then, so like carbon sinks, like the Amazon rainforest, parts of northern Canada, parts of northern Russia, where, it generally is frozen, is now burning and releasing more carbon into the atmosphere, leading to more warming. These are the feedback loops that we're talking about past that 2-degree warming point. So what activists need to do is, well, I should say, is that this 2-degree level of warming would be the upper limit beyond which the world should not venture. And as a result, if we pass that 2-degree warming, it would lead to catastrophic consequences that we can't reverse. So what should they use, at least for these messages, would be using clear and accessible language, avoid using technical jargon, because you'd be speaking to a wide audience and you don't know their technical expertise. Tell the stories that are impacting you and your community. So, for example, right after this conference in Trinidad, I'm heading to a place called the South Oropouche River Basin, where our sea levels have risen so much that salt water is now intruding into the basin itself, and is not only killing off the native species that are there, but it is now intruding into the crops and soils. And once we have salted soils, the land is no longer producible and the productivity drops. And that impacts not only farmers, but also people's homes. The foundations are now becoming eroded. Like, these are the stories that we now have to tell to the public, that climate change is here. And it's going to get worse if we don't do anything about it. You highlight solutions as well. Use credible sources like the UNFCCC, and I'll get to that at the end of what sources you should use. And engage different audiences, because different people will be impacted by climate differently. Advocate for policy changes, and by effectively communicating what these different degrees of warming can do to the world. And keep in mind, 1.5 and 2 are on the better end of what is projected. There's scenarios that take us all the way to 5 degrees of warming, and that will just lead to a catastrophic world.
But you touched on a really good point there, and I was going to leave this question more towards the end for the Q&A part, but it actually fits in really well with what you said, how we communicate our climate science. And somebody asked, what do you think about climate science communication in our mainstream media? So that's directed at you, really. But I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, and I'm not going to answer for you. I'm going to bring it for you. But, we need to tell more stories that show the impact. And there's a difference between, maybe one thing you can touch on is the attribution to climate change, and maybe like a direct cause, because that sort of confuses people too. Climate scientists, we love to stick with stats, and uncertainty is okay. But in a mainstream sense, communicating uncertainty can be very difficult, because, you might say that there's a high likelihood in these IPCC reports.
Yeah.
There's a high likelihood of this happening, and people, so or you don't know, which one is it? Right. And so maybe you can touch on some of those problems that we have with communicating those issues.
So how I like to approach these topics would be not necessarily linking it explicitly to climate change, but talk about what climate change is doing and talk about the impacts that we're seeing, and let the audience do the maths themselves, right? But there are some things in Trinidad, like flooding, for example. I could never just say climate change is causing flooding, because flooding in Trinidad is such a multifaceted issue. We have unplanned developments, changes in our water courses, drainage that can't facilitate the volume of water that comes in, deforestation. We have so many factors that contribute to flooding, that I wouldn't necessarily say, okay, climate change is causing this. But let's look at our temperatures. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a constant increase. In fact, since 1984, our average annual temperature have been rising in both Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is warming about 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world. We don't know why, but it's warming faster.
We're special in the Caribbean, clearly.
Yeah, we are. I mean, our sea levels are rising. It's doubled its rate. It went from 1.5 millimeters a year to 3 millimeters a year within the last 3 decades. So you look at the things that are happening globally and then make it local so that people can see, okay, so the climate is changing globally. How is that impacting us? And when it comes to attributing certain events to climate change, there is a global group called the weather attribution or something like. I'll find it and I'll send it to you so you can share at some point. But they essentially look at different global events. So, for example, the Pakistan floods. They look at hurricanes and tropical cyclones. They look at droughts, extreme heat, and they look at how has climate change influenced this weather and to make it more
Yeah.
extreme.
Yeah.
And that is where it comes. Yes, world weather attribution. Thank you, Delise Williams. Yeah, so they look at the different things that happen globally and how has climate change impacted that to make it worse.
Yeah.
And they do it with different degrees of likelihood. So that's where that confidence comes in. Yeah.
No, it's hard, right? It's always hard when you're so passionate about something. You are down the rabbit hole. You understand these things. At least we all as scientists think we understand these things. It's more the unknowns of the unknowns. But then communicating that with such clarity can often be difficult. You have to sort of break it down. You have to make sure you're not patronizing. You have to be open to, you may be wrong. And somebody may come in with a different perspective and you're like, okay. And I think it's really important as activists that we just don't use blanket statements and we make sure that we're open to anything that we have currently is based on what we know. We may know it really well, but it's based on what we've observed, and time will give us more, and thus science will evolve and all these other things. Speaking of, I'm sure you get a lot of people who look at you and they glossed over looks and like, yeah, yada, 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 yada. Yes, okay, it's getting warmer. Yes, okay, it's flooding. And they're probably saying, okay, well, there's a rise of social media. There's a rise of media. We now know what's happening in Spain and Greece and Bulgaria and all these other places because of technological advances that we would not have had in the past. And they may use an argument saying, well, these things are always happening. You're just seeing it in a more heightened world and the media is very sensational and all these other things. What do you have to say to people who may give you that argument, or people who flat out may just climate deny this is not a thing?
So I'll start with the first part of people who are saying that only because of an interconnected world, we are seeing the impacts. Okay, fair. We are seeing the impacts as people who are displaced from wherever it's happening. So let's look at their climate record. Let's look at how that has evolved over the years and how does this current event play into that. So I'll use Hong Kong as an example. Hong Kong was just hit by an extratropical cyclone 48 hours ago, and it dumped over 600 millimeters of rainfall in a 24-hour period. Let's look at their climate record. How is that rainfall level compared to the 100 and something years of climate records that they have? And if this is number one, well, then why is this the heaviest rainfall event compared to the prior past? What has contributed specifically to this rainfall event? And that's where the world weather attribution people come in. They look at that. And now let's talk about the climate deniers. You have to determine how much energy you're going to put into this, because there are some people who are just proper contrarians and they will argue you till you are cold and dead in your grave. So if you are approaching somebody that you think they could be convinced, find out where your common ground is. Find areas of agreement or common values. And this does not necessarily apply only to climate science. It applies to any topic you're trying to argue. Yeah, find issues that you want to frame it in a way that climate is an issue that affects everybody's well-being. So there could be shared concerns about the environment, health, economic stability. And then you want to ask them what their concerns are. You want to listen with a very open mind and understand where their concerns, their motivations are coming from. And you want to do that through asking open-ended questions to encourage them to express their views and concerns. When they do respond, then you now need to provide what you know well-documented and credible sources of information, which would come from scientific organizations like the IPCC or the UNFCCC or even government agencies. But even that one could be a little bit touchy because some people inherently distrust the government. So you want to, approach that conversation with empathy, avoid confrontation, and avoid aggressive tactics. And again, this is where personal stories can try to level that playing field. So anecdotes, stuff that you've experienced, and try to get that out of them. A very common one that I use is, look at the heat we're experiencing. It is hot outside. And was it always this hot when you were younger? Because we tend to see a lot of these climate deniers on the little bit older side. So you try to engage with their experiences from when they were younger and try to tie it back to what we're experiencing now. But then remember, you're trying to communicate that the climate is changing and we need action now. So you appeal to the shared values that you've gotten from this conversation while highlighting the new impacts that we're experiencing. And now we try to focus on the solutions to get them to act. So you shift in that conversation now from them denying and you fighting that denial to solutions. How could you act and help them? What practical steps we can take and what practical steps you think the government can take to, adapt to climate change. And it's very difficult to adapt to a boiling pot, but to at least make your life a little bit better in this warming world. And something there's a quote that I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you think today is hot, it might be the coolest day in your life going forward. Yeah, that is something that like you can use to drive that heat point home as well. And you want to build relationships with some of these people within their sphere of influence, especially if it's someone that's close to you, and involve third parties who may be more lenient to your point or amenable to your point. And you want to address misinformation head on. Because if you let that misinformation fester, and I deal with this a lot in the weather world, especially with the rise of TikTok, you have people calling for Category 6 hurricanes to be hitting Florida every day. That's not going to happen every day. In fact, Category 6 does not exist on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. But it's stuff like that, we have to address as it happens without platforming the people that are spreading the misinformation. And then you want to celebrate the progress, either the shifts that in thinking that they have or the progress that we are making now. And we also want to advocate for policy changes and all that stuff. So these are just some of the ways that I look into address the deniers. Yeah.
No, it's all very powerful. I think there was a comment coming in that says, wow, I think it's a really good mindset to have. And I remember I have an awful memory, so I may misquote this, but I believe it was a podcast from Malcolm Gladwell. But he was talking about the Jesuit principle, but basically this sort of concept of how you engage with someone who disagrees with you. And it is exactly what you said. You try to find that place of commonality. You say why, and you keep going why until you keep going why, and you break it down. What is your core reasoning? And then you'll soon find that we actually have the exact same core value very often, more than likely than not. And then you can build back up afterwards to then figure out, okay, now that we found what our common value is, whether it's family, security for our children, whether it's the land, agriculture, all of these things, how do we then bring up an understanding around the climate science so that we do realize that, okay, we may disagree, but we do want to protect that core value at the end of the day. And it's all very important what you were saying. I think it's a very positive message. We're not platforming, but we're also not dismissing. We're also being accepting of people. I know I was not like this at the age of 18, that is for sure. I was one hothead and I would be like, okay, you don't agree with science. Well, then you are clearly not fit for science. That was not a nice thing to take, right? But I was coming at an age where I thought I knew things. But I think your message is really strong that we need to just be open and we need to have dialogue. And if you're just going to shut somebody down, they will find somebody else. And that's how bubbles form, right? And it's all about opening up perspectives and your view. And be okay being uncomfortable, I think, is a good sort of message there. But you keep bringing out these nuggets of information. 600 millimeters in Hong Kong, or Greece got a full year overnight. And I feel like you go to bed just reading these amazing books on meteorology that the rest of us clearly are not reading, to come with all these facts this morning. What are some things that you turn to really help bolster your understanding of climate science? That may be way deeper than your average activist, fair enough. And then what are some things you think, if you had to pull out of your chest of information and give it to an activist and say, go off, and this is what I think will really help you communicate your climate science, what would be some of those things?
Okay, so starting from the absolute basics, you are coming into this and you want to know the authoritative facts. The UNFCCC has a really good beginner's guide on understanding climate change. Covering Climate Now also has a Climate 101 page. BBC has a great one as well. These can give you the bare bones that you need to understand the big picture. Now, this is where it starts to get more technical because you need to get facts that apply to you, apply to your country. Now, from a Caribbean perspective, we are all faced with the same issues. So the UNFCCC and the IPCC, they put a state of the climate report out every year. It generally precedes the COP, which is the Global Climate Conference that happens nearly every year. And it is a 3,000, I think the last one was 3,192 pages I had to read. But
bedtime reading, right?
Don't be daunted. They publish as well fact sheets that are very digestible, about 2, 3, 4 pages long, and it covers specific regions of the world. So for us, we would be either in North America, South America, small island states, or the tropics. And there are also thematic ones that look at biodiversity, sea level rise, different aspects. I had it up here just now. Yeah, there we go. So responding to sea level rise, mountains, biodiversity, health, all of those things. So you can just go on the IPCC's website, just search regional fact sheets for the state of the climate, and you would be able to get it up. And look through those for small island states. You'd be able to see what the IPCC, and this is a group of thousands of climate scientists who have come to these whatever the plural of consensus is. And they would be able to tell you, we are seeing with a high level of confidence that, let's say, for example, our precipitation is on the decrease, particularly during our traditional wet season months, which would be the second half of the year. We are seeing with high levels of confidence that our temperatures are rising by X amount of degrees a year. We're seeing with a medium level of confidence that certain other changes are happening, and so on and so forth. Now, I would always suggest, if you're trying to communicate a climate science message, stick with the high confidence ones, because trying to explain a risk is an inherently difficult thing to do for the general population.
Some would say.
When you're trying to tell, well, there's a 20% chance of this, what the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
So, you definitely don't want to get tied up in the nitty-gritty of probabilities. But this is also where you need to tie it back to your local experiences. So the IPCC report and their fact sheets, and then each country is required to submit reports to the UNFCCC on their status of implementing the Paris Agreement through status reports. We are now going on our 4th status reports for different countries. Many of those haven't been submitted yet. So the most recent one you would be seeing would be the 3rd status report back in 2014 to 2016, around there. And within the past, I would say 3 to 4 years, you would get thank you very much, Ariel. That is the fact sheets. Yeah. So you would also be seeing the biannual reports each countries would have submitted to the UNFCCC and the UN on the state of play of climate change in the region and for your country, and what your country is doing about it. Go through that. There's some great nuggets of information that you can find to tailor your message, and you can just start spitting facts at certain people when they say, okay, well, we're not doing anything about reducing our emissions. Well, actually, we've seen a reduction in emissions because we've implemented X, Y, and Z. And lastly, and today is a great day for that. So today is the release of the Global Stocktake reports. Global Stocktake is part of the Paris Agreement framework, where each country needed to take a look at their nationally determined contributions. These are the targets that each country would have set to meet their Paris Agreement targets. So for example, Trinidad and Tobago, we looked at reducing emissions in our industrial sector, transportation sector, and energy sector. So how are we actually monitoring, verifying that, and how has our progress been since 2015 till now? That global stocktake report looks at the progress the world has made towards the Paris Agreement and where are we, what else is needed for us to hit that 2-degree target, and more importantly, hit that 1.5-degree target. That report was released today. I haven't read it, but I did see the summary reports stating that we are wildly, wildly, wildly off target. So go through that report, see what other news agencies are reporting about it, so you get the quick digestible facts that you can also use in your activism.
Yeah, no, that's good. If you want a final question for Colleen from the Q&A, feel free to pop one in while we start to wrap up. But on that last point, and you have a very proactive participant group here, I must say, they are firing off URLs like no tomorrow. You talk about these things that the activists should have in their bag to quickly draw on as a fact. And I think that's very important. I think you see it with a lot of CEOs, for instance. They go on stage and they have these sort of statistics, only about 2 to 3, that add credibility to their communication and can be used across so many different instances. So if you're talking about flooding, or you're talking about hurricanes, or you're talking about salt water getting into your croplands, you have a statistic that is relatable to that drives a message home on a local scale. And that really helps sort of bulk up the communication style, I think, because it gives them credibility and makes your things tangible. And yeah, makes you sound, wow, he gave me a percentage there. She must really know her thing. And on a last note there, unless we get another question in, what are we doing in the Caribbean? You say, we talk about, I know you have this organization yourself, the Weather Center, and you're in meteorology, you're the face on TV trying to disseminate a lot of complex issues. But what are we really doing in the Caribbean to change the communication around climate change? So for instance, when I was in Jamaica, one thing I loved in Jamaica was that a lot of their PTA announcements were in patois. And so you would see an ad about climate change fully in patois. And I love that. It was a sort of representation of their sort of communication style to make sure that there was widely accessible as well, so that it's reaching a large amount of people in a way that they are able to digest that information. So are we doing enough like that? Taking examples from Jamaica across the Caribbean, are we doing enough like that to really reach the public? Give me your 2-minute sort of answer on that one.
Yeah, I know we're pressed for time. So I would say, from my opinion, and keep in mind, I focus on Trinidad and Tobago, and I have very sparse knowledge about what's going on in the other islands, specifically when it comes to communicating climate change and climate risk. As far as I can tell, I would love to see more of that happen in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not sure what's going on in the other islands with regards to communicating on the ground. I do know we have an abundance of resources available and projects that are ongoing across every single island. And we also have the Caribbean Climate, gosh, I'm getting their name wrong, but it's 5Cs. If you Google 5Cs, they have a lot of projects that are ongoing across the region when it comes to communicating climate change and getting the work done that is desperately needed for including climate risk into projects, including climate risk into our infrastructure, our policies, that kind of thing. But I would always say we need more communication at the grassroots level and in parlance that the average Joe can pick it up.
Yeah. And we had a question about climate science education and interrelation. We may touch on that a bit more in the next session actually, which is the intersectionality of climate change. And so that's a good segue. So for everybody who's joined us today, thank you so much. It has been a really lovely conversation, Colleen. You have really shed a lot of light on things. I wish I had your ability to hold stats like that. I will try my best. But I think the key messages that we got here is about sort of bringing that humane touch to your climate science. Don't just keep it to a scientific, purely academic sort of cold delivery in your communication. Tell those stories, create impact through your personal experience with climate change, and we will get there in the end. Hopefully it's fast enough. So thank you so much. Remember, everyone, that this session is not going to automatically lead into the next one. So if you want to join us for the next session on intersectionality of climate change, please do log off of this one and join the other one, and we'll be with you shortly then. Thanks, Ghislaine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.